We published a paper. CNN came out with a story before the press release ever went out. And then within a couple hours, there was such an uproar. It was taken down and CNN apologized. Immediately, I was getting a lot of hate mails. The university had to set up a specific email account for people to complain. So I was sort of checked out. I couldn't even take care of my kids at the time.
Welcome to the XX Lab, where we explore the science and stories that matter to you. Dr. Kristina Durante, welcome to the XX Lab.
Thank you. Good to be here.
All right, so I want to start by starting from the beginning. And you actually spent almost a decade as an entertainment publicist in New York and LA before you became an evolutionary psychologist, and then ultimately an evolutionary psychologist who works in marketing. And I want to know, what is it that made you take that leap?
Well, I was always interested in human behavior because as a publicist, I was never really great at persuading people. It was a culmination of that interest and the fact that I took a job in New York City working for Planet Hollywood as the publicity manager for Planet Hollywood back in the late 90s. And I couldn't wait to get started. But 6 months after I had moved to New York, I was laid off. I had a little bit of a severance from being laid off. And so I started taking night classes at NYU in psychology because I knew that I was interested in human behavior. I guess just, we're all interested in ourselves. It's why are my relationships not working? Why am I not interested in the job I'm doing? What am I interested in? All these big questions. So I started taking the psychology classes and not finding a job. So I was running out of money very, very fast. And so fast that, I was taking psychology classes and buying self-help books and, really, struggling to figure out what I was going to do next. And I didn't want to leave New York City. I don't know why I didn't. Looking back now, it was just one of those times where I was completely disconnected from any rational decision making. So what happened is that I got evicted because I wasn't paying my rent because I eventually did run out of money and I had to move back with my mom. So no more taking, NYU classes. I was spending money I didn't have, and that rope had run out for me. And so I was forced to move back home with my mom in Wisconsin and leave New York City. And that kind of fell deeper into a sort of rut, I guess. I went from being a publicist, going to premieres and, exclusive parties to working at a concrete manufacturing company in Waukesha, Wisconsin as a secretary for concrete salesmen, just to have some money because I was so far in debt. But at the same time, I continued the psychology classes there because I thought, I'm going to get into clinical psychology. So I was taking psychology classes at home, trying to build a life back up for myself from I had totally bottomed out, and working in a battered women's shelter in Waukesha because I thought I wanted to do clinical psychology, I guess, because that was really all I knew. I didn't know about evolutionary psychology. I didn't even know really that you could be an experimental psychologist and conduct research in a lab and be paid to do that without sitting down and being a therapist. I thought that's what it meant. And it wasn't until I took one of the classes that I was taking at night. It was called The Evolution of Human Nature. And that class was all about evolutionary psychology. And that's when we first started reading, the foundational texts in evolutionary psychology and thinking about, adaptive reasoning and how environments shape, bodies and behavior. And that fascinated me. That was really sort of I had a paradigm shift, this is what I've been looking for. These are the answers that I've been looking for.
Yeah, I had a very similar experience. And for those of you who don't have a familiarity with evolutionary psychology, it's just this understanding that a lot of the predispositions that we have inherited because they helped our ancestors survive and reproduce. And what that means is they can really understand a lot about human motivational systems and the human brain and behavior by understanding our tendencies and proclivities as a species in terms of the fact that a lot of them we have because they served one of those functions, right? They helped us survive. They helped us mate. helped us care for children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so sounds like you had the same moment I did, where it's like when you begin to start thinking about human behavior that way, it's hard to like unsee it.
Yeah.
Like it's everywhere that you look. You're like, oh, I bet that's why I do that dumb shit that I do when I'm on dates, is because my ancestors who would have made that same dumb move that I just made probably would have gotten them pregnant.
Yeah.
Right. And they probably would have passed that tendency down to offspring. And I inherited that tendency. And so that for you happened at the University of Wisconsin at Waukesha?
Yeah. So yes, this was basically, it was an evolutionary biology class. And so I was like, oh my God, these are the answers. Like, why doesn't everybody need these answers of the real reason behind it? Like, it just, I could reach to many of the theories of selection to solve a problem that I had observed, like in my life or in somebody else's life. And understanding the source of that problem, it gives you somewhere to stand to be able to help, I don't want to say fix the problem, but just to understand what you might have to do to find a workaround for why you're feeling the way you're feeling. It really sort of was a light bulb moment for me. And I was like, there's no way, because no other area of psychology really talks about the source of why, we behave the way we do and make certain decisions under certain, contextual conditions or whatever. None of it was talking about, like none of my other classes. And, working at the battered women's shelter, that was triage trauma. And so that was a little different. It wasn't like illuminating my understanding of human behavior. I had no idea why for years all of the self-help tools weren't helping me. Like, why couldn't I meditate? Why is this, journaling not helping me? Why isn't, well, my brain was under a 5-alarm fire from all the stress from my entire life. And so I needed, they needed to help my brain get the workaround that it needed to be able to gain traction with the self-help tools. And that workaround comes from, the evolutionary, reasons why we're built the way we're built. And when we experience things like, that we experience in the modern world, even starting with the way that we're parented, the brain kind of, gets this idea that there's a lot of uncertainty and we don't know if tomorrow will come. And so here's how we're going to be making decisions to ensure that we survive long enough to reproduce, and I was like, oh, okay. This really is a wellspring of, really concrete understanding about behavior. And so, yeah, then it was like off to the races. So from there, there's really like the big career for an evolutionary psychologist is academia. So that's kind of how, from the UW Waukesha classes, I then applied to a master's program in psychology at the University of Chicago. Did that first, and then that's when I went to the PhD program at UT Austin, where I met you.
Yeah, so Kristina and I met first at the University of Texas in Austin, probably back in 2002? 2004. And I was in a PhD program there at the time, and she joined the PhD program and went and was working in the research lab across the hallway from where I was doing my research studies as a graduate student. And one of the first studies that you did, I remember that there was always women walking through the hallway carrying little brown paper sacks that I later learned contained ovulation predictor kits, right, which test whether or not women are releasing luteinizing hormone and are about to ovulate. And so can you tell us a little bit about that research study and about what ultimately led you to ask the question about how do women's hormones influence the way that women dress?
Yeah. So I didn't think I would become a hormone researcher when I entered graduate school, but when I was at the University of Chicago, I was working in a lab that did a lot of hormone work with non-human primates and humans too, but all males. So, looking at testosterone effects on behavior. And so when I got to UT Austin, I was interested in looking at how hormones impact women's behavior. It just was sort of a natural, like, well, what about women? And so, at the University of Chicago, it was, well, we don't look at women. It's very complicated, because they have, hormonal fluctuations across the cycle, and you can't, like, at the University of Chicago, we hired like attractive women to flirt with men, and you can make testosterone increase just by putting an attractive woman in front of a man, but you can't put an attractive man in front of a woman and see her estrogen do something different or progesterone. It's very locked in. For a very specific reason, our cycles need to be a precise way for reproduction to occur for women, but for men, it just needs to increase that motivation, like get the candy, and so if you put a candy in front, then the motivation's going to kick in. And so I was just told, well, we don't, women are too complicated. But then when I got to UT Austin, my advisor, Dr. Norm Lee, wanted to do an ovulation study, and Dr. Marty Hazelton, who was at UCLA, she's still at UCLA, she had started an ovulation lab there. And so it wasn't like, women are too complicated. Obviously, there were labs that were looking at women's hormones and their impact on behavior. And so it was my advisor who really wanted to start an ovulation lab within his lab. And so, like, I was his first graduate student. So I got there, and our first meeting, he's like, we're going to start an ovulation lab. And I'm like, okay, I'm just like green and, eager to please. So I was like, all right, let's get to work. And so I actually, I did work with Marty Hazelton. She helped me, with everything, all the materials, learning how to, build a scheduling program we had to basically set up a doctor's office, a 9-to-5 lab staffed by 15 research assistants. Women were coming in all throughout the day, completing hormone tests. And, it was a lot of, blood, sweat, and tears to get it up and running. And then, once it was, then I just collected as much data as I possibly could, asking as many questions as I possibly could. And it was, in hindsight, like, thank goodness, because I left there with just like such valuable data that really helped propel my career, because I had just a number of papers that, came out looking at questions about how women's behavior changes, adaptively across the cycle.
So really quick, I just want to just pause really quick and have you explain to listeners, like, why is it that we would expect that women's behavior would be changing in across the menstrual cycle, and particularly right near ovulation when an egg is being released?
So women experience, two changes in hormones that happen like really close to each other, because, when women are ovulating, estrogen surges right before women ovulate. And then immediately after that happens, the body has to prepare for pregnancy. So another hormone comes in, our pregnancy hormone, progesterone, which we think really operates as a brake for estrogen, which is why we see these within the same woman, a change in her decision making, from what kind of partner she's interested in, to what kind of dress she wants to wear, to, how she wants to invest her money. I mean, it really didn't matter what we put in front of them. These are two different fundamental motivations driven by two different hormones. So with estrogen, it's mating. With progesterone, it's, more family and pregnancy and, safety and protection. And the other one is more of a risk-taking hormone. That's estrogen. That's like, their women's mating hormone.
So when women are near ovulation, so right around that time that sex can lead to conception and estrogen is higher, right? You're saying that it's during this time that women are more risk taking and want more sensation and are looking for mating opportunities. And I remember you telling me about one item, because we were talking about some different research related topics, and we were talking about some of your research that you've done looking at fertility status across the cycle and how it influences behavior. And I remember you telling me, and I still remember I was when you told me this. This was just like how interesting it was to me. I was like pulling weeds in my rose garden at the house I was living at the time. And you were telling me that one of the items that always pops out as like screaming off the page when women are near high fertility is their agreement to the item, I like the way cold water feels on my body when I jump into a pool. Yeah. And just essentially just this idea that when women are at high, like near high fertility and when estrogen is high in the cycle, that they just like to feel.
Yeah.
Like they just like sensation.
Yeah.
And
That was the sensation seeking scale. So, so if you think about it, like, I guess with progesterone, maybe the bar is a little bit lower for what you can tolerate in terms of sensory, the way we move through the world in terms of our senses. But I think the bar gets lifted, it's like, we need more. We need, like, we're not going to just do like the tilt-a-whirl, we need the roller coaster. We need the, death spiral. We need the, the thrill, like we just like thrill seeking more so at ovulation, and it is kind of a parallel to, how male sex hormones work. I mean, it's the same. And, men are the same way. When testosterone is high, they're more risk seeking.
And so, like, when you were, because you and Marty had like some of the first research labs that were really designed to understand women's cycling sex hormones. And so tell me how this works, just to give our listeners a little inside peek of the research lab. Like, what does this look like? So how do you schedule women to come into the research lab and to look under the hood and see what's happening hormonally? Like, what is it that you actually end up doing to try to get women at the right time in the menstrual cycle?
Well, we recruit women. We have to take them through a whole phone interview of questions about just to make sure that their cycles are regular. Then, we ask them questions about their last cycle. And we had this scheduling program that my ex-husband, who did forecast modeling for, Fortune 500 corporations, built a forecast model for ovulatory cycles that ended up being really precise. There was no apps back in that time. A lot of women were tracking their cycles. So we would have to give them benchmarks. Like, maybe you got your period, maybe was there a football game? Like, what were you doing? And then we would predict their next ovulatory phase. And depending on where they were, if they were closer to starting their next period, we would have them come in and complete like a low fertility testing session. And then we would predict when they were going to ovulate, and we'd have them start coming into the lab maybe like 5 to 7 days before that would occur. We were predicting that it would occur. And then they had to come in every single day and do a hormone test until we got that surge in luteinizing hormone. And then we would, within the next day, 24 hours, like schedule their second session.
And one of your first big papers was a paper investigating the effects of ovulation status or fertility status on women's choice of dress. And can you tell us about that study and what you found?
When I got to UT Austin, Norm Lee and I were talking about a study that had come out in 2004. So this is 2004. I'm starting in my graduate program, and another paper comes out. I believe it was published in Evolution and Human Behavior, but I'm not sure. But it was by I think it was his first name is Carl Grammer, but it was like the Discotheque study where he actually went in and he got salivary assays of estrogen of like club goers. And then did this correlation where he found that the higher the estrogen, the skimpier the outfit. So the more revealing the outfit was of people who were at a club. And
I can drop this. I'll drop this study in the show notes so people can check it out themselves.
Okay, so it was just like they had more sheer stuff. I think he might have looked at sheer clothing. So then it was like, but it was kind of like just it was really the first study that ever looked at anything like this. And so that's where we got the idea, like, okay, we called it It's in fact, we called our study the disco study because it was patterned after that German disco, the revealing stuff at the German disco with the high estrogen women. And so,
yeah, it's funny because oh no, I was just gonna say that they're looking at sheer clothing, and you're like, it's 2004, like nobody's wearing sheer clothing anymore.
Yeah.
We're gonna modernize this a little bit and look at something a little better.
Yeah. So what we did was we created like a paper doll, which my advisor normally drew the paper doll in like I have some Illustrator program like that we were using back in the day, and it was just like this really voluptuous woman. So it wasn't like a paper doll like we had as kids where you just like sort of slap on clothes. It looked like a woman's body. And we gave them, because we were thinking like, how are we going to measure it? Well, one way we can measure it is just take a picture of what women are wearing to the lab, going to classes. And that's what we did. But we also wanted to get their outfit that they would choose to wear if they were going to go to a party that night. And there's going to be a lot of single attractive people to start thinking about what you're going to wear. And we gave them this paper doll, this figure of a woman, and a canister of colored pencils, and we asked them to draw the outfit that they would want to wear to the party. And so we got women to do this when they were near ovulation, estrogen's high, and when they were in a lower fertility phase of the cycle, not when they were not starting another cycle, so they weren't on their period. It was that, the luteal phase where progesterone was higher. And so what we found was that, so we had outside raters look at all of these like drawn outfits and rate them for how sexy and how revealing they thought the outfit was. And then we just also measured in square millimeters the amount of exposed skin on these dolls that, they drew their outfit on. And then we found, sure enough, that when women were ovulating, they were drawing sexier outfits that were rated as sexy, outfits that were rated as more revealing at ovulation compared to when they were at a lower fertility point in the cycle. And they were also showing more, skin in square millimeters. So and they were wearing these clothes to the lab, and they were wearing
just like to class,
to the lab. Yeah, just to class. No, so also keep in context. It's not. I did mention like the other study was done at a nightclub. So obviously, most women weren't wearing like really like little black dresses to class. So this would be a change where you might see the woman in the same pair of jeans, but there's more cleavage, for example, at the ovulatory picture than there is at the luteal phase picture, the lower.
You know what?
I remember when we got on like a Zoom before, and we're like, we were supposed to be ovulating because we both had our cleavage out.
Both had on a V-neck. Yeah, and it's so funny because I was just, Kristina and I off camera were just talking about cycles, and I was saying, yeah, I'm about 5 days out of my cycle. Yeah, that's about right. Estrogen's like starting to creep in, and I'm wearing a V-neck. So, yeah, that's embarrassing.
Or it would be like, so it'd be like this on, so because I always got questions of, well, I ovulate, but I would never wear that mini skirt that you're showing me. And I said, yeah, so this is within the range of what each woman would normally wear, because this is the same woman changing over, a short period of time. And so we can detect these small changes. There's a lot of statistical power there because it's yourself changing across time. So like, I would always say like, so if you're somebody who wears a turtleneck every day, then maybe it's like this when you're ovulating, and then when you're not, it's like this, but that would still pick up as a statistically significant difference.
Right. And it's a real difference.
Yeah,
right. And I think that
real. Yeah.
Yeah. And you later found in some other research that women also, when you gave them a shopping paradigm, that at high fertility, so when estrogen is high, in addition to the fact that women will wear more revealing for them clothing, right, and draw these sexier drawings for what they would wear to a party, that if you put women in a shopping, like online shopping type of a context, that the women are also selecting sexier clothes. Is this why we all have that like dress that's in our closet that we bought that we're like, I would never wear that. Like, why did I buy that? Do you think that,
Yeah.
Do you think that we should be buyer beware when we're going shopping with high estrogen? stay away from the risque dress.
Yeah. So, yeah, maybe, I always think that these, it's always good to have more knowledge about yourself and, your preferences and how they change but yeah, I mean, I have a bunch of stuff like that too. In fact, my husband the other week, he was cleaning out a drawer and he's like, "What's this?" And it was like some sexy dress. And he's like, "You never wear this. And you've never worn this for me." And I'm just like, "Oh, I don't know what I was thinking when I was buying that, But yeah, I think, just being aware of, how estrogen operates in terms of impacting decision making versus progesterone. It can, just to understand where you're at, I mean, this better than anybody. I mean, that's what your books are all about, really helping women understand what's going on with their body and why they might be feeling a certain way. Because I think for a long time, part of that was, oh, women, they're all over the place and they're making this decision one minute and this decision the other minute. And it's like, well, wait a minute. We have two huge hormones that are biggies in terms of how they impact behavior, rising at surge levels, one right after the other. And that's part of our biology that we have to deal with. And it was not talked about forever. It's barely talked about now, even. And I think we need to be knowledgeable of like, okay, this is happening and this is how I need to take care of myself when this is happening. And I think part of that knowledge is understanding, okay, I might be motivated. Like there's some great things that come from ovulation. Your sexual desire increases, like all like good things, like you're more active, you can do more at the gym, all that kind of stuff. But the other stuff like, sensation seeking and you just have to know that this is gonna also be part of the package and maybe wait a few days and see if you still want the thing that you were gonna buy, like if there's a cost to it.
Right. Yeah, I think that it is so important to understand how our hormones kind of nudge us into the different like versions of ourselves, right? Where there's like the version of ourselves that's optimized for sex, and then there's the version of ourselves that's optimized for implantation and pregnancy, and understand that does come with motivational shifts, right? And that it might make you feel sexier and more energetic when estrogen is high, and then less energetic and more hungry when progesterone is high. And I think that the more information that we have about this, the better we can understand ourselves. And I just can't imagine a world where that's bad.
Yeah.
I think that understanding ourselves is like the key to everything. I want to talk to you about, speaking of hormones, this was a fun study. So I want to talk to you about some research that you did. And this was during your time at the University of Minnesota. And you did a study where you were looking at, and I think that the study actually started at Texas, and then you completed it at Minnesota. But it was what you call your dad-CAD study. And the reason I love the dad-CAD study is because it really tapped into something that I think so many women have experienced in their own lives, either themselves or their friends, where they find a man that they're really physically attracted to, and this person has absolutely no qualities that suggest that they would be a good partner, right? Like they are actively saying, like, I'm not looking for a relationship. I need to work on me right now. I think that's the line that everybody's using right now. And nonetheless, the women are like, oh, he'll change, right? Yeah. Like, it's like their brain tells themselves a story that will get them to continue to be in that relationship with that person because they're so attracted to them. Yeah. And so you did this study about dads and CADs, and essentially found that when women are at high fertility in the cycle, so again, when estrogen is high and women are sort of primed for attraction and sex can lead to conception, that this leads women to have that veil of ignorance, right? Where their brain is telling them this story. So can you tell us a little bit about what you found in the dad-CAD study?
Yeah. So it started out, I just had the hypothesis that when women were near ovulation, they were going to let these CAD guys get kind of, off the hook. Like they were like, hey, I thought they'd actually I didn't think they'd delude themselves about how great of a partner they would be long term. I thought they would say, I will make a trade-off here, and I will accept you as a sexual partner, knowing that you're probably not going to stick around.
Right. So this is the sexy guy, right?
Yeah,
this is
like
we're talking about the cad.
okay,
we're talking about the sexy guy.
Yeah, and so as part of that, I thought, so it's like, if you are a guy and you are a 9 or a 10 on attractiveness, then you don't have to be a 9 or a 10 on, doing dishes and mowing the lawn and all that kind of stuff. Like, you might get off the hook for being messy or something like that. So the very first study I ran, I had women, looking at dating profiles of a guy who was kind of like, the cad, very good looking, charismatic. And then I asked him a bunch of questions about, their, what they would expect from this guy. And so part of those questions, being a graduate student, I was like, whatever, I'll ask this about, what they would require from them in terms, how much they thought this guy would help them out, around the house and do all that stuff. And I thought that they would select them as partners and then let them get off the hook for the household chores and stuff like that. And so, but I didn't find that.
So you were expecting that women would look at these sexy guys and say, oh yeah, he's not helping with the dishes. And so essentially giving him a pass.
It's okay. Look how cute he is.
Yeah, he's so cute. So I don't mind that he doesn't, but that's not what you found.
No.
So what did you find?
But what I found, so I did not find that. What I found is that women liked these men and they wanted to start relationships with them. They wanted to date them. But so what I found was that they had increased perceptions of how good these guys were going to be around the house and how good of a long-term partner that they were going to be for them. And so they weren't, when they were thinking about this in terms of, so this is just projection, fantasy, not fantasy, but forecasting how good this guy will be as a potential partner for you. It was all elevated when women were ovulating compared to when they were not ovulating. So basically they were deluding themselves near ovulation and coming to see these guys as better potential future partners than they were actually likely to be. So it's they had this sort of rose-colored glasses that came on at ovulation specifically for these kind of guys. And so we called it, when we wrote the paper up, we called it a delusion. And I remember when we went through the peer review process, the reviewers didn't like us saying that women were deluding themselves about these guys because we were basic, but so we had to reword it and finesse it a little bit. It's we had, we're just coming to see them as a little bit, in a rosier colored light than maybe they should have been seen, because we, in the further studies, we were actually able to, where we had women actually interacting with these kind of guys, then we were able to get more in depth into what was actually going on and actually show that, even women who are ovulating, if they're observing this guy talking to another woman, they can see right through that guy if it's for another woman and say he's not good for that woman. But when they're thinking about them with that guy, it's for me, I think he'll be doing the dishes, and I think he'll be a good dad, and I think he'll be a great long-term partner.
I mean, I think that we've all been in that situation. Totally. I mean, on both sides, because we see our friends, right, where they're with this person who's Mr. No Good, he's Mr. Bad Idea. Mm-hmm. And you can see it perfectly clearly when you're outside of the picture, right? Where you're that guy is not going to change. You know, he's he's no good. He's not going to be a good partner. He's never going to be a good partner. And you try to say that to your friends, and they're like, oh no, but it's different. You should see him with me. Right. Or they'll say, I know, but inside, again, there's this almost this shroud of ignorance that our brains are doing, potentially on purpose, right? Because when we delude ourselves, if to use that word that the reviewers hated so much, but if our brain plays a trick on us, mm-hmm. And gets us to believe that this person is actually going to be a good, high quality partner, then that might increase the probability that we form a relationship with them, and then we, get the good genes for the get the good genes for the offspring, even if it means that we end up with a kind of a deadbeat partner.
Yeah. I mean, it's sexual receptivity, but then you have to do some cognitive gymnastics to tell the part of your brain that's like the break, like, wait, what are we doing? Oh no. It's like your limbic system saying, oh no, he's going to be great. Just don't worry about
he's
it.
Gonna be fine.
He'll be good. He'll be good. He'll
so
be doing the
funny.
dishes. Don't worry. Don't worry. Calm down. It's like that extra push that like, you need to feel okay with it.
I love that study for so many reasons, including it helped explain my 20s. My 20s made so much more sense. But I've always been really taken by research on how our brain is so strategic, in the way that we create reality for ourselves, and like the story that our brain tells ourselves. One of my favorite stories that I like to talk about is I have a friend here in Dallas, and she, every time like it's near ovulation, her brain, and she does not want to have children. So she is somebody who's childless by choice. But every time that she's getting close to ovulation, because she's cycling naturally, she starts to think like a baby would be fun. Like if she's getting into a sexual context, like her brain will start to tell herself stories about like, have unprotected sex. Like it will be awesome. Like you don't want to wear a condom right now. Like having a baby would be amazing. And then as soon as they're done having sex, she's like, I am so glad I did not listen to my brain.
Oh, that's so
because it was like, isn't that funny? Yeah. It's just like these stories that our unconscious mind will try to tell our conscious brain to get it to do things that ultimately will lead to gene transmission. I think that it's worthwhile to know about these things. If only, and this happens to everybody, folks. This isn't like a women's brains tell themselves stories thing and men's do not, because I can. Like post-nut clarity is all about men's brains telling them stories until they have sex with someone. And then they're like, no, actually she's a troll.
Right. Yeah.
Men's
brains do this all the time. Even when we talk about like business, workplace leadership, like they are like, let's try it. Let's give it a try. And then, if it fails, they get, it's like they're more okay with, just swinging for the fences. And so when we're ovulating, we're swinging for the fences. And, men do the same thing.
Right, exactly. So it's like women do not have a monopoly on strategic storytelling on the part of their unconscious mind. This is something that we see with both men and women, and because of course your research career has focused on women so much, of course we talk about it mostly from that perspective here.
Yeah.
So I want to now talk about your ovulation and political preferences paper. And I want to talk about this because I think it's really important. And this is something that readers of This Is Your Brain on Birth Control are familiar with, because I tell the story there when I talk about the politicization of women's sex hormones and how it has been very difficult for researchers who study women's hormones, especially when we're talking about women's hormones influencing behavior. How one of the challenges that has confronted researchers like you has been the fact that people get really on edge about talking about women's hormones on one hand and then behavior in the other. And so I want you to just first walk us through the ovulation and political preferences paper, and then talk a little bit about what happened after.
Okay. So that paper really came about because, like I had mentioned before, I was running a lot of different studies looking at, changes in women's behavior across the ovulatory cycle. And as part of that, I was asking questions related to religiosity, like how religious you are, how often you go to church, from that all the way to social political issues, like how they feel about abortion and at the time, legalizing marijuana, which when we were running the studies wasn't really legal anywhere, and just to see how they were feeling about it. And I noticed that, I did kind of feel like, hey, when women are ovulating, like if they're getting this surge of sex hormone, maybe it's hard to think about God. knowing what we know about like what we need to tell ourselves to feel okay with two conflicting feelings, which would be sexual desire and a strong belief in God and faith and all that kind of stuff. They kind of clash a little bit. And so what I was finding was that when women were near ovulation, they were getting a little bit less religious. So this is within the same woman. So we're not talking about huge swings where it's like, I am a devout Catholic, now I'm an atheist. Like, that's not what we were saying. These are very small shifts on a scale, like, when you report pencil and paper. And so then I got to thinking, like, okay, this might be something. And I got kind of excited about it. And when I had collected some further data, it looked like relationship status was moderating it, such that single women, particularly when they were ovulating, were becoming less religious and more liberal in terms of their socially political attitudes about abortion and same-sex marriage and legalizing marijuana. And they all kind of, your social political attitudes kind of cluster together, like, they kind of hang together. So we're not talking about fiscal stuff, like economics, like that wasn't shifting, but, you think about having like a increase in sexual desire. And then when you're thinking about, restricting marriage and, going to church, you're like, well, I don't know, maybe not this week, it was kind of like that. And so single women were getting less religious and more politically liberal. And then women who were married and in serious committed relationships were doing the opposite. And they were feeling more religious and moving more towards social political conservatism. So they were feeling like, they weren't as supportive of abortion or, legalizing drugs or same-sex marriage. And so that's kind of what the paper was showing. And we didn't have all the answers as to, well, why are married women doing this and why are single women doing that? And a lot of it comes down to, we want our behavior and attitudes to be as tightly aligned as possible. So if you are a married woman and maybe you're feeling a little bit more sexual desire, you maybe it feels better to remind yourself that what's good is the faith in God and, and being
monogamy and staying with your,
not being loose and restricting that part of yourself, because that you're living that life where single women weren't, and so they're feeling the sexual desire and they're able to act on it. And so if you're going to act on it and your behavior is going to be, let's see who we can, hooking up or whatever, because these were young-ish women. I mean, they were naturally cycling, so they're going to be on the outside. And so that's kind of what we thought was going on. And, that they were, it's that cognitive dissonance that we feel. So that's just like an uneasy feeling when our behavior is one way and our attitudes are the other. So we want to try to have those meet as tightly and be as aligned as possible. And so we do this cognitive motivational reasoning in our head that makes it feel more aligned with one another. What we're doing behavior-wise is now aligned with what my attitudes are.
Right. So like, you're a single woman, you are at high fertility, estrogen is surging, your mating motive, you're sort of primed for attraction and sex. And these women are just sort of like tapping the brakes a little bit on their beliefs about, maybe, they're like, you should wait to have sex until you're married or whatever it is. They're kind of tapping them, kind of like ignoring those beliefs that they might have a little bit, because it would be inconsistent with what they want to do, right? Which would potentially go out and meet partners and flirt and do other things, right? Whereas with women who are in relationships, then that this is going to tap the brakes on any sort of interest that they might have. Like if they notice the really sexy mailman, right, that they're going to just sort of try to reinforce their existing relationship by tapping the brakes on that sort of sexual interest. So essentially, hormones sort of amping the volume up on different types of impulses, and women trying to sort of silence beliefs that are counter to the type of behavioral path that they might be on given their relationship status. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary of exactly what we were seeing.
Right. And so you find this really interesting set of results that to you and to me doesn't seem controversial because we study hormones and we study women and we study brains and we study people and we understand that there's a biological component to every single thing that we do. Right. So even if it's something random, like if I started juggling and singing Justin Bieber songs, that would be the result of different types of synaptic pathways firing in my brain, different neurotransmitters. There'd be a hormonal piece involved. I mean, it's like it's all the gears and sprockets, right? And so understanding the role that hormones play in terms of nudging our behavior this way and that way, to me never feels controversial because it's like, well, like, of course they're involved. And just like the same way that if you were like, oh, neurotransmitter X, like serotonin this or, dopamine that, it'd be like, yeah, of course, we're going to see that this is involved because what is the alternative? It's like, we know that these processes influence the brain. And so you like, to me, that didn't sound controversial. It sounded actually really theoretically, really interesting. I think you felt the same way. Right. Yeah. And so then what happened next?
So we published a paper in Psychological Science, which is the premier journal in psychology. And this was early on in my career. So I was a junior faculty member and not tenured, very excited that this was coming out because this was, when we publish in leading journals, this is a big deal for how we're evaluated for promotion. So I was excited. And I wanted to use, sometimes when you have a big paper coming out, your university will do a press release on this paper to, drum up excitement for it. And also the university gets some publicity from it. And so that's what my university was doing. The University of Texas, San Antonio is where I was an assistant professor. And so the media office was preparing a press release on this finding, and they asked me if I wanted to give an exclusive story to one leading media outlet. And I said, yeah, that would be great. I was so excited to talk about this because still in my mind, it was like, this is so cool. Because what I didn't talk about that the paper included was that this was, I think the paper actually was published in 2013, but the study was conducted during the 2012 presidential election between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. And so when I say religiosity is moving around and social political attitudes are moving around near ovulation, moderated by relationship status, I thought, well, maybe the one downstream, decision that might be affected would be who women want as their presidential candidate. And so we asked that too. So in my mind, and so we found that single women who are ovulating were sort of nudged a little bit toward the direction of Barack Obama, and married women who were ovulating were nudged a little bit toward the direction of Mitt Romney, who was the Republican candidate running against Barack Obama. And so I was like, wow, I was just thinking like, this is going to be huge. And I'm so proud of myself and couldn't wait for the study to come out. And I chose CNN as the media outlet that I was going to give the early story to, where they would get to run the story for 24 hours before the press release went out. And so CNN came out with the story before the press release ever went out. And the story, I forget what the title was, but it was like women's hormones change the way they vote or something like this. And CNN at the time had an election ticker tape, like a little box that had all the election coverage. And that's where it was first posted. And so it was super noticeable. And it had that, women's hormones change their votes, something like that. And it went live and I was like, yay. And then within a couple hours, there was such an uproar that it was taken down, and CNN apologized for putting content on their website that didn't meet their editorial standards or something like this, they said.
So what was this backlash? What was this uproar?
Well, it was the fact that there was an article out saying that women's hormones influence their votes. At least that was the title, and that's what it was insinuating. So on the surface of it, when you say women vote with their hormones, realize all of this in hindsight now. When you say women vote with their hormones, there are negative stereotypes attached to that. And so that was perceived as dangerous to have that headline out there, especially in an election cycle.
Right. And I mean, and that headline is, I mean, I think we can both agree is not a good headline.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So
it's not true.
Right.
Right. I mean, because it's not like, oh, your hormones are like the only thing that are influencing your behavior, and that women are therefore fickle and unpredictable, and they shouldn't be allowed to vote. And the readership of CNN seemed to believe otherwise. And I think in part the headline, I mean, it was not doing you any favors.
No, this was something that I didn't realize was going to be like it was really good fodder for like a sensationalized headline that, there's no way it was going to have nuance, where it's like, oh, wait a minute, like these weren't like very big swings. It was, again, when, these are small changes. These aren't like one day I'm, a Catholic, very religious, and the next day I'm an atheist and voting for Obama. That's not what we were seeing, very small shifts. But that doesn't get communicated. And anything that was ever published related to men's hormones and their political preferences, it was like that literature didn't exist. Like it was just like women whose hormones would be doing this, because women are all over the map. And that was was seen as dangerous because it was feeding into stereotypes about women. And, a lot of folks thought it was dangerous because, I was getting a lot of hate mail saying, if women lose the vote, it's your fault.
Wow.
And I was just like, I was not prepared. I wish in hindsight, like I was like, oh, you should have seen it. But I was, a junior faculty member. I was just excited about my research.
Right. And as a junior faculty member, for people who aren't listening, this is like before you have tenure and your contract gets renewed every year. And so you can lose your job. It's like, it's very easy to lose your job. And to go through something where you have major media outlets pulling coverage on your research, and then you're getting terrible phone calls and emails. I was actually with you during part of the time when you were getting some of this backlash, and then wasn't there, and I think that there was like a special session that had to be held by some higher ups at the university with your department chairs to just like talk about what was happening.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that felt very unnerving.
Yeah, I didn't know what was going on until the dust settled. Thank goodness that the chair of my department was not only supportive of me, but he was taking these meetings on my behalf without my knowing, because I was pretty devastated, because I was I was seeing all of these emails. They were coming directly to me and some to my university. So much so that the university had to set up a specific email account for people to complain about my study. And, so I was sort of checked out. I was in this like sort of state of like, didn't really realize like I was a robot. I was like just so dissociated that I couldn't even take care of my kids at the time. So later I found out that the chair of my department was taking these meetings because there were people on the board of regents for the University of Texas system that were upset that the University of Texas was employing a researcher who would study these things. And so that's kind of like also constraint on a academic, I also, trying to control what kind of questions they ask. But, all of this at the time, I was just like, it's not worth it. The study is not worth it. Like, it wasn't worth the publishing of it for the backlash. For me, psychologically, it was the darkest time in my life, because it was so voluminous. Like, there were so many people who didn't like me that I heard about, and for my brain, I couldn't handle it. Like, it's hard for anybody to handle the amount of criticism and rejection and just people who are in their own different moods that we think they don't like us or whatever. But, and I'm highly sensitive to that to begin with. So for me to be hearing it everywhere, I didn't know how to walk through life. I just took it very personally. Like, how dare I ask this question? Like, I believed it. How dare I ask this question? What kind of a researcher am I? I'm setting women's clock back 100 years, for the vote or something. And other women hate me. And, the support that I was being given was ironically through like conservative like media. Like, Rush Limbaugh was one of my biggest defenders at the time.
That's a hard day. That's a hard day when you have Rush Limbaugh as your supporter.
Yeah, but yeah, it was hard. So yes, so there was a huge amount of blowback. Some of it was hidden from me, thank God, but a lot of it I saw. And I think at that moment I was like, gosh, there's just so much negative stereotypes tied up in women's hormones, and I didn't have the stomach for it.
For those of you, who don't have, which I'm guessing is most of you who are listening, don't have a background in, sort of the politics of research science, the research surrounding ovulation, changes in women's sex hormones, cycling sex hormones in women, and their downstream impacts on behavior. As soon as a paper is published saying that women's sex hormones are related, changes in sex hormones are related to this, about 9 to 12 months later, you'll have a paper that's published that says, no, they don't. It really feels like it's almost been a modern day witch hunt with researchers going after some of the work that you've done, some of the work that Marty's done, some of the work that Steve Gangas has done. And this is some of the seminal early research. I mean, a lot of you who are listening are probably aware of, these books that have been written by people like, Elisa Vitti, where it's like In the Flow, and it's talking about cycles and how they change and how they influence behavior. A lot of this early work started with these group of researchers that we're talking about here, who have been sort of unduly criticized. So what do you think this means for science?
Well, I don't know. I do think that there are, there are so many, including your books and the book you just mentioned, like, this is a topic that women are discussing. We kind of are more aware, thanks to your book, about, giving women a birth control pill and making sure they don't, their hormones are, not cycling, and how dangerous that can be potentially depending on the person. And I think there's just like more conversation now surrounding women and their hormones, and, why we have the cycling hormones that we do. What's the reason we have those? How can we take care of ourselves? Knowing that we have, two very big hormones that do two very different things that, increase within the time span of a week from each other. I mean, these are big things. I think that there's more of a conversation now. So I am hopeful that, younger scholars feel more comfortable. And I already know that because I get contacted a lot by, I have this idea and I want to look at this in an ovulatory study. And then I say, I'm not doing ovulatory studies. And there's two parts to that. One part is that I'm not doing it anymore because I'm a little gun shy. The other part is that I'm in a business school and it's not really set up to have a lab like we did at the University of Texas, Austin, where it is a lab that's set up for physiological measures and having women, come in and do hormone tests. And, we don't have that kind of separate space at a business school. So it's a little hard to run. I'd have to, there are ways to do it. So it's not like it's prohibitive. I would just have to, get collaborators in the psychology department. And so, but, talk about the research being, creating an uproar in psychology. In the business world, it's even more foreign. So I was always sort of like the odd researcher out. So there wasn't a lot of incentive for me to keep going. with the hormones. And I had done a lot, I've published a lot. So I thought, okay, somebody else can take the reign. And, I think there are a lot of other, scholars that are interested in this. So I'm hopeful that it will continue. And certainly in the medical field, I feel like maybe this is gaining more traction, that we're looking at studies on how certain drugs are impacting women differently than men. And, kind of, I think this is like your banner on your website. It's like, you are not a small man. Women are not small men. You can't run a study on men and see how their bodies react and then make a blanket statement about how X is affecting Y. We need to look at populations of women also.
Yeah, David Buss and I actually just submitted a paper that we wrote together. So David Buss was my graduate school mentor, and he's kind of a luminary in the field of evolutionary psychology. And we just wrote a paper called "Why Ignoring Biological Sex Differences is Bad for Everyone, but Especially Women." And it talks about that issue of, that even though there's political reasons that people want to ignore and try to downplay the fact that there's sex differences in psychological states and biological states, et cetera, et cetera. But ignoring them is like the furthest thing that we can do from being helpful to women. It's dangerous for us. And we've seen this with drugs, as you've noted, because certainly women metabolize drugs differently than men do. And we see this in law. So he talks in that paper about the reasonable person standard, and how if you assume the reasonable person standard for something like sexual harassment, and the reasonable person standard is, would a reasonable person consider this behavior to be harassing? It turns out that the answer to that depends on whether you're talking to a reasonable man or a reasonable woman, because reasonable women see a lot more behaviors as being potentially dangerous and harassing than men do. And so if a woman is charging somebody with sexual harassment, and the jurors are primarily male, that can skew the result against her favor, right? And unless we acknowledge that sex matters in law, in medicine, in psychology and psychotherapy, in the study of things like Alzheimer's disease. I mean, it's like, unless we really wrap our arms around the fact that sex matters, it's ultimately the people who lose the most are women.
So going back to something you said, biological sex has been politicized, and so why can't we talk about it? And I obviously I kind of know why. I talked about the negative stereotypes about women, not having the vote because, women are sort of lesser than men. And I think that, because the sort of, and this is sort of like an armchair, philosophical question, but, why is it that we can't talk about how men and women are different? We're two different genders. We don't have exactly this. There are some things that are the same. We regulate temperature the same. We digest, but there's
right, but even that differs, right? Because
it's like how can we it's like for the healthcare of women, we need to be able to talk about this without fear of being silenced, because God forbid there are differences between men and women. And I understand why, but it's I don't know what the answer is to try to thread that needle in a way that is palatable for everybody to hear.
Right. And so we tried to do that. And I certainly tried to do it in both of my books. I talk about that because I think it is an important needle to try to thread, because I do think that, and it's understandable that there's a fear that if you say sex matters, that then it becomes that, oh, well, sex is the only thing that matters. And, oh, gender doesn't matter. And that gender and sex must be the same. And if they're not, then there's something wrong with you. And that's just not true, right? If you're saying biological sex matters, it's just simply a statement about the way that your biology was put together has an impact on everything ranging from your responses to psychotherapy to thermoregulation, the way that your body thermoregulates, to the way that your body opsonizes bacteria. We just learned that in some immunological literature that we were reading for a study we're doing. It influences the way that you see behaviors as harassing or not harassing. And so it's just a statement about how you're put together. And that doesn't mean that it's your destiny. And it doesn't mean that that the way that you feel or experience yourself necessarily needs to match your biological sex. It's just a statement about two different things. And like one of the things that I talk about frequently when I'm discussing this particular issue is, if you are a transgendered man, so you're a biological female who's transitioned into being a man, you're still at a greater risk for Alzheimer's disease. And you need to know that. And your doctor needs to know that, right? That's important information to have. And so, and the fact that you're at a greater risk for Alzheimer's disease and that that's something that your doctor should be keeping an eye on, does not mean that that needs to be prescriptive for how you experience the world. And you don't need to wear a dress, and you don't need to have female genitalia, and you don't need to, you don't need any of that stuff. It's just simply a statement about how you're put together that is useful for helping to essentially allow the world to be able to better care for you, and look out for you. And so I get frustrated sometimes too. It's like, on the one hand, I do understand the history, and certainly, even with the thing that happened with CNN, their headline was not the way to go. Right. But like, I'm like you though, because I come from a science background. Like, I was naive. I wouldn't have even thought about that headline being problematic, because it just is so much, I'm so used to having seen research papers on men's hormones influencing social dominance, orientation, and, political motivation and all of that. And just recognizing that hormones are just part of the machinery, and without thinking about the history. And I think that bad history, it means we've got a lot of work to,
I know, because I didn't want to contribute to that. I mean, the last thing I want to do is close doors for women or reinforce arguments against having more opportunity in the world. That's the last thing I wanted to do. So I was like, okay, well, I want to be helpful, not hurtful, with my research. And so that's kind of what threw me into a different direction. But I do think that we need this knowledge to be able to better care for ourselves as women. And this does not mean that we can't go out and do anything and everything that we want to do, but we do need to be aware of how the underlying biology that works within us, women, operates, so that we can care for ourselves and not just pretend like this doesn't do anything important, and I really do think that your listeners understand this, because we as women how many times have we sat in doctors' offices saying, but I am getting this thing because I had the thing where I would get this brain fog where I'd be like talking in public and then I'd zone out, remember? And I was like, I think it's my hormones. Like, I think it's menopause. No. I think that was I on hormones before you were on hormones? I've been on it for over a decade now.
Right. Yeah, that's right. You were on it longer than me, because I remember I remember you telling me about that, because I had brain fog too before I started estrogen. Yeah, which helped. Yeah, and for me it was the testosterone. Because I had always, even though I went through menopause early, I had always had pretty robust testosterone, but then that dropped. And I didn't realize it did until I started having blood work done. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe, if we boost that a little bit. And it has helped tremendously. But like, I remember sitting in my gynecologist's office saying, I'm getting this. I think it has to do with some hormones. And, I asked her for a little more estrogen. And she's like, well, are you getting hot flashes? And I said, no. Are you having trouble sleeping? I guess not really. Well, then no, we don't need to change, so... we just, I feel like we've all had situations where we're not listened to, and certainly not thought that, hormones do anything. Oh, that reminds me of we used to share a doctor in Dallas when we were having babies. And I remember the doctor was like, so what do you do? Sarah does this. What do you do? And I go, oh, I look at hormones, women's hormones, and how they impact behavior. And he was like, women's hormones impact behavior? Like, you talking about PMS? It's like, no, like decisions, like what they want to buy. He's like, that wouldn't happen. And I'm like, it does, and he was just, that was my Yeah, and I think that and for so long, I think that that's like how everyone has been.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's like so many people, even in obstetrics and gynecology, are just think that hormones influence the body from the neck down. And yeah, that's so funny. I remember you telling me that story where hormones influence behavior. That's crazy.
That's a crazy thing. It's a thing.
What a crazy thing. You know, it's funny because I was having a conversation with a researcher who's at the University of Utah, and she was doing a study looking at body composition across the cycle. So actually putting women in DEXA scanners and then also a bod pod a metabolic cart. So essentially looking at resting metabolic rate in women and how body composition and resting metabolic rate changes across the cycle. And one of the most robust findings in physiology that's actually looked at women's hormones is that resting metabolic rate increases between 7 to 11% in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. Because your body's just churning and burning with your high core body temperature. And anyway, what was really interesting when talking to her about the research was that, you know, most of the women have that pattern, but some women will go through a luteal phase and not have a change in body composition or resting metabolic rate, which I thought was really interesting. And so she's going to be looking at the actual hormone levels and seeing, because her hypothesis and mine, just listening to it, is that you know, it's possible that these women had a fail to ovulate cycle, and so it's not a true luteal phase, or they're not releasing progesterone. But you know, one of the things that I have always you know, but I think that's probably part of it. But another thing is that you get so much variability in people's responses to hormones was the other takeaway. And, you know, when we talk about some of these research studies that have been found, including your work, where you find that, you know, women want to dress sexier, and they, you know, and there's been others work where they find that women sound sexier and smell sexier, and they want more sex, and, you know, they're attracted to this type of partner. And, you know, there's a lot of variability in this, and the way that we respond to our hormones is variable. And I think that one thing I just want to note, as people and listeners are considering this episode and considering the way that hormones influence behavior, is that there's no one size fits all answer. And, you know, and I think a lot of the messiness in the research literature is really a reflection of, one, the fact that you get a lot of failure to ovulate cycles. And I think that sometimes when people are looking at hormones and not testing hormones, that you're getting these bad cycles, because we find when we're collecting data that when we're looking at women only who have regular cycles and, you know, and are healthy and, you know, young and fertile and et cetera, like, and we're testing for ovulation, we'll get failure to ovulate in about 30% of the sample pretty regularly. And which again, you know, if you're listening to this and you're somebody who's concerned about your cycle, stress is and lack of social support, and, you know, lack of calories, all of these things can contribute to individual cycles where we fail to ovulate. But I also think that there's, you know, still a lot that we don't know about individual sensitivities to hormonal shifts that I think is really interesting. And I'm hoping that, you know, the future batch of researchers moving forward helps us better understand that, because I do think that for some women, the types of changes that we get are more robust than others. And certainly they're going to be more robust cycle to cycle too. Like if you have a really strong cycle with a lot of hormone production, like I think you're going to see more of those changes than you do if it's a weak cycle with lower hormone release. Yeah. I mean, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's so much variance through all the years that I was doing ovulatory cycle work and measuring women's hormones. I mean, there was, you know, and I was doing them on myself too. So I would see myself, you know, go through different, you know, cycles that felt different than others. And certainly we saw this in the women too, where they wouldn't necessarily ovulate. You know, we had a lot of women for which that didn't happen. There is a lot of variability, and it's really interesting that you say that, because there are women who just don't sense a change, and then there are, you know, in their feelings and behavior, and then there are some women who are so tuned in
So, since you have sort of shifted out of studying women's sex hormones, which to the detriment of the field, but certainly understandable, do you like you've studied a variety of different aspects of both consumer behavior and then also just like and continuing with sort of an eye on women. A lot of your research has continued to sort of focus a lot on things that are important to women. I want to talk a little bit about an issue or one of the topics of your research that I think is really interesting, and it's the topic of serendipity.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And I want to talk about that because it's something that I think all of us have had this experience and would love to learn a little bit more about. But I want you to tell us, what is serendipity? And like, why is it that people enjoy things when they happen serendipitously more than they do when it's planned?
Yeah.
So start like, what is serendipity?
So, serendipity, not a lot of people know what it is. In fact, we had an uphill battle when we decided to study serendipity because there was no real, definition of what the ingredients were that would create it. And so it's basically just an unexpected discovery, something that you weren't expecting to find, and you do find it. But, there was a movie called Serendipity that came out in 2001 that starred Kate Beckinsale and John Cusack. And so they meet unexpectedly at a department store over gloves, the like meet cute where it's like, I want the scarf and you're like, okay. So they meet each other, are attracted to one another, and they decide to carry that conversation over to share an ice cream together at the ice cream shop, Serendipity in New York. They have a great conversation, but they're both involved with other people, so they just say goodbye there. But then both forget a personal item at the ice cream shop, and so they both come back to the ice cream shop to retrieve that personal item, and they see each other again. And it's just, the attraction is immediate and it's intense, and that's like a meet cute on steroids. Like, that's what serendipity is. It's just something that you weren't expecting, and so part of that is surprise, but a bigger part of that, I think, than surprise is actually that it was chance. Like, the brain looks for a reason why something happened. Like, our brain wants to solve a mystery. Like, why did both of us come back to the ice cream shop? Why is this tray of cookies here? Like, if we can't find a reason through all the research that I found, which I just love, the brain comes up with a reason just to close the book on that investigation. And that reason is, it must be fate. It's a destiny, and with that is a little bit of magic. And so it's that plus what's absent when you run into something, randomly, whether it's a song, a movie, a piece of chocolate, a pen, a person, is that you think that, this was somehow fated, because I don't know how I came to have seen this person. And what is also absent when you're choosing something is opportunity cost. So you don't judge whatever you have in front of you against all the other options you could have. So we find serendipity to be very protective against, like, for example, if you meet a partner serendipitously, we find that it protects against that drop in satisfaction that you get when when we ran studies where we had people looking at profiles on a dating app and choosing a partner versus when they just meet someone unexpectedly. Even though it's like the same person that we set it up for them to meet, they have this enhanced perception of how much, would they just say, I like this guy? I don't know. There's the liking increases, and we asked them a question like, do you think you'd fall in love with this person? And that was even increasing if they met the person serendipitously. And then we kept showing them the picture of the person, which is how you test for satiation. Like, I just don't want to have a bite of this cracker anymore. I'm done. Like, I'm satisfied with this cracker. Serendipity buffered against that. So they just remained equally satisfied. They just liked seeing that person's picture again if they met him serendipitously. And we think that it's just like that magic where you just aren't seeing the opportunity cost. And when I say opportunity cost, I just mean when you're making a choice, like we do almost in every situation in life, whether it's a partner, a movie we're going to watch, or a restaurant we're going to go to. Once we make the choice, we're less satisfied with it because what rises to the fore of our brain is all of the other options that could we have chosen better. And serendipity takes that away. And not only that, it doesn't feel like we're giving up control over choice. It's just something surprising that happened, and we don't know why it happened. So the brain just says, okay, maybe it's chance. There's like a little bit of magic pixie dust with it. And I just found that so fascinating. Like in my own life, that's kind of how I came about the research idea, was just noticing how I liked songs that came across my old Four Taurus radio more than when I played them for my music library.
No, I have the exact same reaction. I was actually just gonna ask if that was the same thing, because I have the same thing. Like if I hear something that pops on the radio, I'm so much more into it than if it's on a playlist that I curated, because then it just feels like, well, I knew that was going to happen, and so
the probability of that happening was pretty high because I had programmed it in there.
Yeah, can it get us in trouble? And I'm asking this because I was in a relationship that I let last way too long based on two pieces of serendipity. So one is, this is a person that I was in a relationship with who just so happened to know somebody in common that I knew who lives in New York City, right? Which is like a very random thing that we both know this person in common. I was like, yeah, I've got this friend in New York. And I said her name, and he said, oh, and then said her middle name. And I was like, how do you know her? And it turns out that she was dating his roommate, because he lived in New York City for a while when he was early career. And anyway, so there was that. Yeah. And so I thought, oh my gosh, there's something there. And then we used the same soap. like there's this like brand of like non-toxic soap that you get at Whole Foods, and it's a little niche, and I use it all over the house for hand soap, and so does he. And so when I saw that, again, it was like the serendipitous thing, where I'm like, this is clearly fated, right? Whole Foods soap. Right. Yeah. And that we knew this one person in common in New York. And it was not a good relationship for me. And I stayed in it way too long because of these serendipitously, I feel like, occurring things where he knew this other person that I did, and this. And so can having this be toxic? Can it lead us into a bad way? Is serendipity always good?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's an interesting question. So I don't know. If you just told me that story, I would. So we like people who are similar to us. So all of these cues, even down to like when your birthday is, if it's the same, if your name sounds like the other person, your liking for them increases kind of linearly the more similarities you have. But also hidden in that, you're right, is serendipity. It's like, what are the chances this guy uses the same soap? What are the chances that this person knows somebody, the same person in New York? So I think that maybe the two were operating together. Maybe, I don't know how you met this person, but yeah, I think, that certainly it can put the rose-colored glasses on potentially, because that's kind of what we were seeing a little bit of. Like, I guess if we want to look at it, if this person isn't right for you, it might take a little bit longer to actually see reality because of the magic of serendipity, that we're not judging. But then we can look at the flip side. It's like, well, we're being harsh to the choices we actually, we're judging them more harshly, what we actually choose, than we probably should, because we're living in this world of oversaturated abundance where there's always something better to be had. And so I think that does more negative damage to our everyday life of feeling dissatisfied with just things and life in general, because our brain wants to retain the control. There's so much choices out there. There's so many things we could be doing that we just see what we don't have instead of what we do have. But yeah, I think that it could potentially lead you to stay in a relationship too long.
Yeah. We'll talk off camera more about that one. So I want to quickly talk about a topic that's becoming a more center in your research world, particularly in light of the fact that you have a new book that's going to be coming out in about a year, which I'm going to have you back on to talk about that. But it's about this idea of evolutionary mismatch, right? And this idea that we have inherited this brain that allowed our ancestors to be able to successfully survive and reproduce, right? In environments that aren't always the same as the environments that we live in now, right? And in a lot of ways, I think our environments have gotten a lot easier, right? So we have dishwashers and we have cars and we have a lot of these conveniences that evolutionarily, like our ancestors did not have. But they've also created a cultural landscape that's a lot different than the ones that our ancestors lived in, right? The world, essentially, in short, is different now than what it is throughout most of our evolutionary history. And so our brain isn't always well adapted or well equipped to manage like our current environment. And, one of the things I always think about as a woman in particular is that life is a lot easier than it was for my great great grandmother, even, and certainly for my distant female ancestors, right? Because I do have a dishwasher and I've got a job, right? I'm able to work outside the home. And so I don't have like a limited potential in the way that women used to. And I think that I'm not alone in feeling like sometimes it feels like still something's missing, right? I think that women are anxious and overburdened and overstressed and sometimes have a difficult time forming social connection and just feel overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And do you think that is the result of evolutionary mismatch? And are we not, is trying to do everything all at once essentially at odds with our biology in some way that makes it unpleasant?
Yeah.
Like
I mean, I think all of the deficits to mental and physical health have to do with evolutionary mismatch. So certainly, for men and women, but certainly for women, we feel a lot of responsibility over many things in life for how well we take care of the house, for how well we take care of our kids, for how well we are at scheduling everything that everybody needs in the family, how well we are at our job. We feel that pressure to sort of hit it out of the park across all of these different aspects of life. And that is crippling. It's too high of a bar that nobody who is a human being can expect to reach. So we just, as women, have too much expectations for ourselves, and our biology just can't meet those expectations.
Is that because of like social media? Is it because we're like seeing everybody's highlight reel, like that we have these expectations?
That doesn't help. And it's everywhere now. And we're, think about how, the brain is designed, so whether you're 100 years old or 100 minutes old, you have a brain that is designed for an environment that has been gone for 300,000 years. And we have not caught up. And not only that, but we've gotten a lot stranger in terms of our what our environment looks like now, even in the past 20 years. It's accelerated, it's expanded that gap between what your brain expects to see every morning and what it actually sees. So in one sense, yes, we've created this modern world, but as innovation just speeds ahead, it has surpassed our brain's ability to shape shift and be able to adapt to those changes. So it has essentially outpaced our adaptive range of how we can get a sense of, a new strategy or feeling good, even living in our modern world. So our brain gets sort of stuck in the social cognition part of, our thinking, and it takes away from our ability to focus because we're seeing so many things out there about what other people are doing. We're, and part of that does have to do with social media, right? So it's like we're connected with so many people, and many of us live in densely populated areas that we are doing things. We've never been more separate but together. So it's like where your brain wants to see some collaboration and cooperation just for a sense that we have some sort of belonging, like we matter in some way so that we can like de-stress. We're not even getting an opportunity to ever really see that because we're not even, like how it was in the 1950s, where at least there was some semblance of community. Like we don't really have that anymore. We're just like in our houses in our little apartments doing our own little thing, and but we see all these people, and we know that we're amongst people, but we don't really get a sense that if we fell off the face of the earth, anybody would really care. So that we're lacking that, and it's that is part of what feeds for many people the chronic stress that leads to the deficits to mental and physical health, and it sort of manifests differently for everybody, but it's there. Our world is so different. We're competing more than we're cooperating, and that's not what the brain is used to find a sense that we belong. We don't have that.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that people always talk about with evolutionary mismatch is with like our diets, right? Because that one's really easy to see, right? Where you have ultra processed foods, and then we've evolved or inherited this preference for sweet and fatty foods, and then you plop that into an environment where we're no longer living, from hunting and gathering and eating food from the land, and instead we have all this ultra processed food. And when you have this brain and that is wired to have a reward response in response to things that are sweet and fatty, it can get you into trouble, right? Where you end up in this situation where everything is not necessarily good for you, and you end up over consuming calories, and then you end up overweight and your body becomes sick. And so you're saying that like psychologically, that there's also a lot happening in our environment. So almost like we can look at it like an ultra processed environment, right? Where you have a lack of real experiences, right? Where there's, and you're seeing things on screens, and essentially that your brain, just like our gut, isn't like really, and the rest of our body isn't designed to thrive off of ultra processed foods, that psychologically, we also might maybe not be thriving based on our current environment, because essentially it's all of these changes have created unnecessary stress.
Right. Yeah. I guess the important piece of that is understanding what your brain is designed for. And that is for living within a small group where you have knowledge of everybody that's living in your group, and you all share you have a similar goal, you help each other, you collaborate to survive. That's what we were doing for millions of years of human history. And now we're not doing that anymore. I mean, our world looks nothing like the world that our brain is designed for. Much like the food example, we have bodies, or we have brains that are now seeing, instead of the collaboration where we have, it's not like, so like 300,000 years ago, or not even that long ago, like 12,000 years ago, we weren't like, oh, I don't belong, and what's my purpose? Like that was built into life. Like we didn't go looking for it. So we're not designed to find it, and that's what self-help tells us to do. And we wonder why we can't do it. Like why am I not finding my purpose? Like everybody else has a purpose. I don't have a purpose, because that's not something we ever really needed to find, because that really was built into the fabric of life. Now, fast forward us to our modern digital age, and it's sort of a weird mixture of seeing people around everywhere, where you have a brain that registers everybody you see as somebody who might be important, trying to figure out if this person is important, but we never really get to know anybody that well. So there's so much uncertainty in our social world that our brain just gets stressed out by it. And this starts, I'm not talking about like when you are a teenager or when you're in your 40s, like this starts from birth. The brain is like born into a world that cannot support it, because we don't have a tight-knit community where we are doing collaborative child rearing, even from like day one of your life. And so this mismatch, it was just sort of fascinating to me when I was writing the book, because it starts from literally the day you're born, where your brain is butting up against the things in our modern environment that aren't giving it what it needs. And in that light, it made a lot of the psychological deficits that we see that are increasing today on orders of magnitude make so much more sense. It's like oh, no self-help tool is going to survive contact with a stressed brain that has been that way from day one when it learned that the world might be threatening, because we just didn't have the support that the brain needs from early on, even in childhood.
So what can we do as like adults? So obviously we can't like rewind the clock and go back to our childhood. But like what can we do to try to bridge the gap and sort of bring back some of the types of environments, or like bring back aspects of environments that our brains are optimized for, without having to like give up deodorant or like start eating like a caveman. Yeah. Like I don't want to eat like a caveman.
No, we don't want to go back to like caveman days or what is it, like Stone Age days. Like, I want to keep my, modern amenities. And I want to keep living in, we have to all keep living in the modern world. We're not all going to move to communes and, do all that kind of stuff. But, like I said, like knowledge of this stuff gives you some place to stand. Okay. I understand that I have a brain that wants to understand that they belong, that we belong. Because once I have that, my brain gets a sense of safety, because being ostracized or, not included was a death sentence across human history. We needed each other. So for somebody to say, I don't want that, I don't like your proposal, I'm, wondering if somebody's in a bad mood because they don't say hello to you, like your brain is on constant high alert because it just doesn't have that sense. So, okay, I need to give my brain a sense of belonging and sort of put, blinders on to help me not see these other people that don't really matter in my life. Their opinion doesn't affect me as much. So, we really need to be conscious of evaluating the people, like doing a social network audit. That's part of what I, kind of include in the book, and like really figuring out like who is good material for what, like a mini tribe. I call a mini tribe in my micro community. And then just having those people who, if they qualify and have like some qualifiers, like those are the people who, from where I get my belonging. And so when, my paper gets rejected, that's not, I understand that my brain might try to register that as a big problem, because I'm hearing somebody who's alive, tell me that I'm rejected. And like I said, on some level, your brain is categorizing even somebody who you don't even know as potentially important to your life. Because if, over the course of our evolutionary history, if someone walked into your living space or came through in some way, that person was important. It was either somebody who was in your group or an enemy. Either way, you had to pay attention to them. And so now we're paying attention to a bunch of people who don't matter.
Yeah, I remember there's been so many times when one of my children would get upset about something that's happening on social media or something. And I'm like, just don't log in. And like, none of that's real. Yeah. Like, it's not real. And if you don't log in, it's not your reality. And I remember I had a conversation with Gabby Reese, the former pro volleyball player, and she's married to surfer Laird Hamilton, and he's like notoriously off the grid, like he doesn't pay attention to what's happening on social media or anything. And there was a little bit of a firestorm after a comment that he made, and it was like blowing up the internet. And Gabby went out into the garage, and he was just kind of like sanding a surfboard. And, and she's like, doesn't this bother you? Like there's people saying these things. And he's like, who are these people? Do I see them at the coffee shop? Are they neighbors? Are they my family members? And she's like, no, it's just these people. And he's like, those aren't real. That's not real. Yeah. And then just like went back to sanding a surfboard. And I think there's a really good lesson in there for all of us. And that is, it really is easy to have your reality distorted by the bigness of the internet world.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about buying a plant? Like if I buy a plant, like I always feel like I'm looking for like really simple, the strategies that I can do to try to make my brain feel more at peace. And I do like being outside, and I get green exercise most days. I go for a walk in addition to whatever else it is that I might do. And I really think that does a good job of setting my brain in the right space and making it feel happy and regulated. Are there other just like simple things people can do? Is it the usual suspect, like get a good night's sleep?
No, I don't talk about any of that in the book, because that's the stuff that's hard to do until your brain kind of is able to. You're able to sort of give it the workaround it needs to see through the modern world with sort of like the old world lens or the yesterday's brain lens. That really is what will help all of those. It'll give the self-help stuff that we hear all the time more power, like being in nature and, all that kind of stuff that is good for us, like meditating if you can, or breath work or gratitude journals, all of that. I think at least it was the case for me, which is why I wanted to write the book. Like then all of the self-help tools were able to work once I was able to sort of help my brain see what, understand what I was going through and able to sort of like do the little things that sort of help my brain get back on track. But like, it kind of sounds like, well, one of the things that is really sort of ground zero is just creating that, safe haven, secure base that most of us didn't get in childhood for ourselves within our home. And that sounds a lot like it could be wherever your safe space is that you create for yourself in your home, with the things that bring you the most comfort. And the reason that's sort of step one is because that when you're in your safe space, you can regulate your emotions. You can learn a lot more about how you react to certain things. You can tune in more into your body. Like you can learn how your hormones might be affecting how you feel, because you just can get more tuned in to yourself when you feel safe. And that happens from the things that bring you comfort. And that's different for everybody, but it could be like being in nature. So it might be your outside space for you. For me, it's like my weighted blanket in my bedroom is my safe haven. Like that's always like clean and has all my comforts and my hot beverages and stuff like that. But yeah, no, I just basically the book really talks about like giving information on here's how the brain was designed to handle these kind of situations, and here's what it's encountering today. Now that we know that this is the gap, let's try to think about ways that we can minimize that and stay living in our modern world and not go live in the middle of with the Shuar village and the Amazon or whatever.
So listeners, I've got to tell you this quick story, and then I know I'm going to let Kristina. Yeah, the Shuar village. So Kristina and I met when we were both graduate students, as I noted at the University of Texas, and we went to a research conference together. And we shared a hotel room at this research conference. It was in Philadelphia. And I think it was 2005.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure, or like I think it was 2005. And we shared a hotel room, and we were like just like shooting the shit at night, and we're talking about how we landed in evolutionary psychology as a research field, and I was talking about how I majored in anthropology as an undergraduate, and Kristina, I knew that she was going to be my friend for life when she told me that she thought about maybe doing anthropology, but then realized that she'd have to do field work, which is where these anthropologists like go in these, these remote villages and like live in a hut. And she said, and I knew I'd have to do field work. And I know that there's not a Four Seasons Shuar village. And
Which would be the only way that you and I would do field work.
Yeah, I know. It's like, I know, I knew exactly. That just made me laugh because I was like, yes, I would. Yeah. I cannot do field work also because for the exact same reasons. Like I have not. I'm not a person who does.
Right.
I don't rough it. I don't rough it very
but
well.
We have colleagues that
gentlemen.
do. So like when we do go to these conferences, we see like a portion of the talks are about people who live in traditional almost exactly as how our hunter-gatherer ancestors did in these remote villages and in the middle of nowhere in Africa and in South America. And so we're hearing them give talks and we're just like, yeah, I think we were, yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome.
The only way we would do that is if we could stay at the Four Seasons.
Yeah, the Four Seasons Shore Village.
Kalahari Desert.
Yeah. I think it's Shore Village, Kalahari. Yeah, and it's like such, that research is so great, and I'm so glad other people are doing it.
Oh my gosh. And that really came in handy for I immerse myself in that literature. Like, I can't believe how these researchers operate. Like, it's fascinating. They're basically running the same studies we do in our labs and universities around the world. With these indigenous people who don't speak English and they don't have certain systems or words for things, but yet they can, find ways to translate these surveys. And I just think it's so fascinating. And thank goodness for that.
Yes, exactly. Thank goodness for that and their incredible research. And then also that we're not the ones who have to do it. Because I can't imagine that Shore Village scenario is just not one for me. No. I'm too high maintenance for that.
Yeah.
So I want to close by just asking you a little bit, tell me when your book is going to be out so that way listeners can find out when they're going to be able to go and download it, and what is it called?
Okay, yeah. So my book is called Simple: Yesterday's Brain, Today's World, and the Forgotten Science of Living Well. And it's coming out March 10th of 2027. So we have a little bit of time, but I can't wait.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'll have you back on to talk about the book once we get a little bit closer in. But in the meantime, where can listeners find you online or on social platforms?
So I am on Instagram at Kristina_Durante. And that I'm really only active there. I'm also on LinkedIn. And then they can just Google me.
Okay, great. And do you have a website?
Oh, yeah. KristinaDurante.com.
All right. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Kristina, for joining us on the XX Lab. And thank you to all of you for listening.
Thank you.
And that's it for today's episode of the XX Lab. If you want more, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show, a rating or review helps other people find it. See you next episode.